Good evening, good evening, good evening, beautiful people. Thank you for joining us on this fantastic evening where we are going into Toestanden, the first edition online, where we will be discussing public space in times of crisis with the luminous Ilze Wolff and Ola Hassanain. My name is Kopano Maroga. I am a performance artist, writer, culture worker, currently working at the Kunstencentrum Vooruit as a dramaturg and programmer. And tonight we have two fantastic guests. Ola Hassanain has trained her focus on the subtle politics of space, namely how both spaces react to and reinforce violence from state entities, which in turn creates a built environment that reflects, responds to, regulates the lives of those who inhabit it. Her most recent work explores as an idea of space as discourse, an expanded notion of space that encompasses political and environmental questions. Her work tries to develop a spatial vocabulary that follows how ruptures presented by political events make it possible to aspire to new kinds of ecologies. Ilze Wolff co-directs Wolff Architects with Heinrich Wolff, a practice concerned with an architecture of consequence. In 2017, she received an international prize for scholarly works in modern and contemporary art and architecture in Rome for her book, Unstitching Rex's True Form, the story of an African factory. In 2018, she was shortlisted for the Architectural Review's Moira Gemmell Award, and between 2017 and 2019, she was a fellow at the University of the Western Cape Center for Humanities Research. She co-founded Pamphlet, a publication for art and architecture, which has since received institutional support from William Kentridge's Center for the Less Good Idea, the Chicago Architectural Biennale, and formed part of the Publishing Against the Grain exhibition at the Zeitz Mocha Museum in Cape Town. Through the practice and with her colleagues at Wolff, their space in Boerkaap has hosted exhibitions, interventions, publications, and talks in collaboration with artists, activists, and scholars, and in that way developing an enduring public culture around the city, space, and personhood. A mouthful. Thank you for joining us, you wonderful, wonderful, wonderful people. Just a note for our guests that are joining us inside of the webinar. If you are having questions during the process of the conversation that we're having tonight, I want to invite you to put those questions into the Q&A, which you will find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So if there are any questions that are coming up that you would like the panelists to address specifically in terms of the content that is being raised, please put those questions in there. And if you're watching us from Facebook Live, you can put the questions that you have into the comment section, and one of the people that are working on the back end, the technical back end of Red, will transplant those questions into the Q&A. If there are any kind of technical difficulties that people are having in terms of sound, in terms of audio, in terms of video, I'm going to invite you to put those in the chat function, the chat box, which you'll find on the right of your screen. And if there are any things that you want to share more broadly with everyone, if one of the panelists would like to share something, if anyone knows of a particularly interesting reading, video, etc., I'm going to invite you to share all of that in the chat function. And if you're on Facebook, you can feel free to share that in the chat function in the Facebook video. Without further ado, I want to go further into introducing a little bit of what Toestanden is. Toestanden is a format that is a collaboration between Vooruit, Victoria de Luxe, Lucas School of Arts, and the Masareel Fonds. And in this particular edition, we're looking at having a debate series where we engage with fascinating guests about things and things that are keeping us up at night. And this particular edition, we want to have a conversation around how Corona is shaking up our societies. Much attention is rightly paid to how we can prevent or contain contamination, but the various measures that are imposed generate uneven effects. In recent months, we have seen tensions arise around the use of our public spaces, beach zones, sea dikes, and swimming ponds, suddenly turned into privatized spaces that were only accessible on payment on the basis of territorial principles. The coronavirus affects certain freedoms that we considered to be particularly evident until recently. It also presents us with major challenges in the coming months. In what way should our government pay special attention to small house families? We active citizens from different layers of the population must also actively think about this. In addition to the strong emphasis on the medical aspects, is there not a need for an expert group to study the social impact of Corona? And how do young people experience the imposed measures and the restrictions of their freedoms? These are but a few of the things that we're going to be touching on in the conversation now with Ola and Ilze. And before we go any further, I want to give both of you an opportunity to introduce yourselves in your own words, because I have said far more than enough. So I want to give the word over firstly to Ola Hassanain. If you can briefly say who you are, where in the world you are, how you are doing, and what the context of the environment that you're in, the city, the country, is in relation to COVID-19 and more broadly socio-politically.
Always forget that I'm muted.
Thank
you. Thank you for this introduction, and I think I'll just add to it what I'm actually doing now, which is the PhD, which is I'm a PhD candidate at the Academy of Fine Arts, Vienna, and I'm working on a project titled "A Thought of the Outside," and just kind of trying to think of the outside as a concept that brings us outside of state terror, allows us to think about things outside of state terror, which is, for me, classifies as the sort of constant crisis we're under. I think with regards to where I'm from Sudan also, and I'm sort of between Sudan and the Netherlands. Right now I'm in the Netherlands, in Utrecht, and of course the measures for the coronavirus situation has changed throughout the last 2 weeks or so. There isn't the full lockdown, but there's been regulations with regards to avoiding public transport, the time frames of establishments being open, and of course more screen time for all of us, which is I find still battling with it and finding it difficult, but of course everybody is on the same boat here with this situation. Well, not everyone, but with regards to people who are dealing with screens. So in relation to, I'll just go back to that notion of the outside for a bit. I think the concept of the outside is something that I'm working on because it enables me to open up space to become political discourse. So I'm kind of using this frame of this research project to actually push for political projects to become more spatial. Just because I think the physical environment has been, for as long as we can recognize, been treated as something that's very much static and in the background, yet it carries so much of the state ideology and regulatory ideas of world making and thus future making as well. So I focus specifically on architectural aspects just because they are chief professions of space making for the time being. And I'm trying to open that up so that architecture maybe can become an extension of human ecology rather than a direct channel of manifesting state ideology. So maybe that's just to keep it short, and then we can.
Thank you. That is so powerful. That piece about transitioning from using architecture as an extension of state terror or state violence or state surveillance to an extension of human ecology is such a beautiful reframing of the agency, public agency that people should be allowed to have over their space, but that is often taken away, as you say, by the kind of the lack of consent between the state and the public. So I think that's a really beautiful way of phrasing that, and thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing. So
thank you.
I want to give the word over to Ilze. Same questions. Could you tell us a little bit about who you are, where it is in the world you are currently, how you're doing in general, and what the general context of the environment that you find yourself is in relation to COVID-19 and in relation to sociopolitics in general.
Thank you very much for this invitation, Kopano. I'm thrilled to be in conversation with Ola. Also, that is a beautiful definition of how you would like architecture to be an extension of a human ecology. I've never thought of it like that, but it's very similar in terms of how I think the aspirations of our practice is, you know. So I'm in practice with my partner, life partner. We call each other partners in crime. And we run a practice in Boerkaap in Cape Town. Boerkaap, those of you who are in the Netherlands might recognize the term Upper Cape. So Cape Town was at one point a refreshment station for Dutch settlers to refresh themselves en route to other parts of the world where they were gathering spices, goods, and enslaved people. So I'm sort of sitting here as part of a legacy of colonial settlement and also colonial destruction, you know, around space. We cannot, as architects, disavow that legacy, and there's a lot of disavowal going around in our practice, in our industry. And part of our situatedness in the Boerkaap and in Cape Town and on our space is to constantly think, how do we first acknowledge that sort of embeddedness in this history? How do we gather wisdoms to do better and intervene with wisdom, you know? And two, like Ola was saying now, this beautiful definition to extend architecture as a human ecology. So that is a kind of, we sort of settled in a very deep history of settler modernity that has kind of, you know, transformed in what we're sitting with today, which is a kind of a hyper capitalist kind of very alienating sense of being and place. Extending from that is, you know, how do we then note the current situations of, you know, reaching out with each other, you know, through these kind of very screened environments and these kind of, you know, technologically driven ways of connecting. At the moment in South Africa, we are sitting at what they call level 1, stage level 1 COVID, you know, regulations, which means we've moved from a complete lockdown in March, where we were not allowed to move out of our homes except for emergencies and grocery shopping, to kind of a space we are free to move extensively where we want, but we have to be minimum 1.5 meters away from each other, and we have to be masked, and there's also a curfew where everybody has to be in by 12 o'clock. The curfew is meant to be relaxed soon, and there's been a series of kind of limitations on how we be and how we are, including a smoking ban, a very controversial smoking ban, and a alcohol ban. And it actually has released very interesting kind of, you know, senses of being. And I mean, it doesn't affect me. I'm not a smoker, and I'm a social drinker. So for me, having a glass of wine is part of gathering. So it didn't really affect me because I wasn't gathering with people. So, you know, they were those kinds of things. So I think that, you know, we've transitioned from a very severe kind of lockdown, bans and limitations to movement to where we are now kind of, you know, the government is asking individuals to take responsibility essentially for how to deal. So that's where we are in the world. I'm feeling okay. Thank you for that question. You know, panelists never get asked how we're feeling. So I'm okay. I'm not in the greatest space because there's a lot of work pressure. It's right in the middle of dinner time. So I have a sense that my family is now there feeding and eating without me. So that's not really not ideal, but I'm feeling very happy to be in this space in conversation with you guys. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Ilze, so much for taking the time away from family, away from work to have this conversation and to share with us your practice and your insights, which I feel are so urgent at this particular moment, specifically in the field that you're working with and the contestation of that field, of public space, of architecture, of the built environment. But I think it's really important how I feel both you and Ola bring so much of your personhood into the work that you do, into a field that historically has been devoid of or removed personhood from its study or from the heart of its study. So I think that's really beautiful. And I think it's really important, at least for me, to be able to localize that and to acknowledge that practically, to check in with how you're doing, because so much is moving through you and you're at the intersection of so much. So it's just to say that I really appreciate you and I really appreciate the work that you guys are doing. And I really appreciate you guys taking the time.
Thank you. Of course, of course.
I wanted to start, such a pleasure. I wanted to start with a question that I feel bridges both of your practices somewhat. And as I was looking through the work that you guys are both doing in different spaces from different kind of axes, but in similar forms, through the forms of architecture, often through the forms of art or artistic propositions. A lot of the work that you are doing is looking at this discrepancy between architectural theory, as we have inherited it from predominantly Western canons and Western kind of thought within universities, and the ways in which those have been passed down, the construction of cities, at least in the Western world and the Westernized world, whatever that can mean. Looking at this discrepancy between architectural theory and the lived realities that the built environment creates for certain people, subjects of the state, as Ola might phrase it. And I wondered for both of you how this discrepancy between architectural theory and lived realities of people in the built environment, how that has come to shape your practice, and if there are any examples, any practical examples in the form of projects that you have or are working on that can elucidate or illuminate a little bit of this discrepancy between the theoretical and then the reality that people are experiencing in cities. I want to give it over to Ola if you'd like to start.
Thank you. That's a pretty loaded question, but I'll try to answer it as articulate as I can be about it. And I'll start by a big sort of, well, not realization, but the frustration I've had with how we're engaging with, the state and its politics, or let's say engaging in the public sphere. And the language of politics we've had so far has, been very much around the performative sort of element. And I started to think about like what, in that situation, if I'm, in a position of, from the position of an architect, what, how do you engage in the difficulties and these policies that are popping out and how politics is affecting everyday life? So it became very, I felt that there was a problem with this like performative element that seems to lock us down into this sort of level of futility where, people protest and they're of course up against the state the moment they protest, and the state has all this power to sometimes, of course, obliterate people. And I started to think about, well, what, the site where this happens, where basically state violence or state terror unravels. And I started to think about the implications of space in the state terror, and how from the position of architecture, how much do we know about that as people who are producing space, under this, profession. So I, of course, to sort of break down these moments, or, make moments for myself to analyze, I maybe can start with like the situation of this notion of like an outside. And so the situation of the Khartoum's political turmoil. And I was watching this video, and of course, this is not the first incident you kind of watch the moment of a demonstration, and then the state kind of, you know, either shooting people or you know, shooting gas canisters, and just this notion of like pushing people into a sort of restoration of order, you know, so bringing back everything onto a public space that has to be silent, basically. So our norm is this silence and the absence of a kind of event. But it immediately made it clear to me that I felt that there's something about this space that hosts this restoring of order that the state seems to always kind of want to go back into. That seemed very complicit, you know, to me in keeping this in order. And so the public space became a very contested space to me. And so I just started to look at like, okay, urban planning and what like terms like urbanization in relation to architecture, what do they mean? And this forecasting role that the architect has, you know, as architects, we come with these prepositions, we sit down with the client and we're like, okay, so this is what the building is going to look like. And this is the time frame of the building. And we're, you know, we have this capacity, of course, we're given this role to monumentalize whatever the client needs. And I thought that that's an interesting position. The first off, that we have this forecasting capacity, you know, into the future, like building, imagining up a future, literally, and having it erected. And then the second one would be the fact that we're able to, this position of like working from an inside, from an enclosure, because of course we start imagining with the premise of property as our start point, right? And so I was thinking that we're trained to think from the departure point of thinking of things from property, and so we think from enclosures, and then we start to imagine outside of that, you know, of this particular like plan or map, and then what is outside. So also this ability to create an outside from a position of an inside. And of course, that's of course open to debate, yani, if the outside already had existed and we created enclosures, or we first off had to create an enclosure to be able to look at the outside. So I started to think about it in that relation, that this seems like an interesting position that could be actually contaminated to if we premise things beyond property. And I looked at, you know, of course, one of the main sort of inspirational conversations alongside, of course, the experiential factor was this conversation around the Black Outdoors. It was a conversation between Saidiya Hartman and Fred Moten at Duke University, which was a series of conversations. But that specific one had a lot of threads that I thought of, like, you know, why can't we evoke spatiality in these types of implications? And so we can, and in a way, like, be able to have architects think beyond property lines, basically. And since they have that interesting sort of position that is, you know, able to look at the future, able to, you know, envision it and make it happen in a sense. And also this perspective of like working from the inside, you know, and we are, of course, under state violence. We understand that the state has a sort of functioning within their imaginary. So I was just thinking that, you know, my architectural education didn't really encompass these complexities. You know, it was always introducing me to the user as also sort of this mono-human, you know. And I maybe would refer back to some of the writings of Sylvia Wynter with that, which is that, you know, the binary man, which is the Eurocentric white man, and so all users are presumed as that. And maybe you're familiar with, like, you know, documents like Neufeld, you know, with all these sort of internationalized and standardized ways of doing things, and it's literally like a fixed assumption about who comes into the building. But not only that, we also are not educated about how insular the process of space making is from the position of architecture. So I always tell people, like, we don't really need users to make the building happen. You know, it's a process. The user is something that happens after the architect walks away. And I feel that that's something that has to be, you know, allowed to fuse together, you know, and that the user actually becomes part of the decision making. And so in many of my works, I actually entertain this performative element of the charrette. I do a lot of, and the charrette is this, you know, the moment where in architectural firms, you know, you lay out all these plans or maquette, and you bring in your clients and the, you know, people who are designing it or whatever, and then you have this discussion about it of, you know, people shifting and writing little notes. So this point of gathering became really intriguing to me, because I felt that, you know, we really don't think of the process of architecture as gathering, and we always think about gathering also in a positive connotation. So it's a gathering that's really very much like military decision making and drawing territories and whatnot. And so just slowly I started to see that, you know, after I graduated and started to practice architecture for like 7 years, it became very clear that whatever I studied from Neufeld and learned from, you know, all these big names, that there was this, just like there was a monohuman, of how Sylvia Wynter puts it, that monohuman has been able to be centered, but also created sensibilities of architecture itself. And so it became an indirect way of sort of a materiality that regulates life, and it indexes people's relation to the state because it has that capacity to regulate life. And it's just it became very very clear to me that because of how we are, how architecture is implicated in state violence, it also makes it possible, should we be able to premise the architecture practice on different, let's say, ideologies, it might actually be a point of change. But of course, that's too ambitious from my perspective, but it's something worth, I think, contaminating a little bit.
That's so powerful. Yeah, I really, I find it so powerful how you explicitly frame architecture and the practice and architects as complicit in cultivating or creating the stage for state violence to be performed on people and on the public. I think that that's such a clear framing of that practice that I don't think I've heard before, and I really appreciate that. It settles things in a way that becomes quite tangible or quite workable. And what you're saying about imagination, about how the schooling process dictates the parameters of what is imaginable, it makes me think of Adrienne Maree Brown, the work of Adrienne Maree Brown, who's a Black African futurist, who wrote a text, Emergent Strategy. And in Emergent Strategy, she says that imagination is one of the spoils of colonization, which in many ways is claiming who gets to imagine the future for a given geography. Losing our imagination is a symptom of trauma. Reclaiming the right to dream the future, strengthening the muscle to imagine together as Black people, is a revolutionary decolonizing activity. We are living in the ancestral imagination of others, with their longing for safety and abundance, a longing that didn't include us. We are living now inside the imagination of people who thought economic disparity and environmental destruction were acceptable costs for their power. It is our right and responsibility to write ourselves into the future. And a lot of what you're saying in terms of imagination, not only in terms of the schooling process of architects, not only in the construction of the built environment to facilitate the violence of the state, so much of that has to do with how much we think is possible, who is imagined to be the intended user, as you say, who is the model, who is the archetype of the user. And so much of that is a lot of what you're saying, a lot of what you were speaking about really highlights or indicates or gestures towards this lack of imagination or the suppression of imagination, specifically for subjugated people. And I want to take the opportunity to give the word over to Ilze with the same question, looking at this discrepancy between architectural theory and then the lived reality that people experience in the built environment. How, for you as someone who's practicing in Cape Town, arguably one of the most contested spaces of public space with a long-standing history of structural apartheid and separation on the lines of race, how has that discrepancy, that friction between theory and the practical reality of people's lives affected you and your practice as an architect and maker?
Thank you. I have similar ideas around architectural training that Ola has raised. And I think in essence, my practice and my collective practice with my partner and my colleagues is in essence a refusal of that, that sort of, knowledge that was offered at the University of Cape Town. And it is a refusal to accept, that is the way to practice architecture. So there was an emphasis on the architect as a professional being, to imagine space for others. There was a very clear message that architect, that central person, is a particular kind of person, that doesn't necessarily look like me or look like my family members, or there was a perceived implicit message that any other kind of imaginative response is different to the kind of status quo that the university or the architectural theorists offered as an education. There was also a sense that architecture is an exclusive disciplinary practice that doesn't necessarily require a kind of, and I like what Ola said, contamination, because it is a kind of a discrete disciplinary practice that could possibly work on its own terms and be autonomous, when in essence, obviously it cannot. It requires contamination from other disciplines, artistic practice, musical practice, anything beyond the kind of technological emphasis that we were trained into imagining architecture. So what that means is that, we are always thinking of architecture as a developmental practice, so we are developing buildings, we're developing space on behalf of others, and not in commune with others, sort of not necessarily in commune or in gathering or in collaboration with others in other disciplinary realms. So our practice is in essence a refusal of that kind of canon, but it's not a complete refusal, because what was on offer is a kind of a disciplinary knowledge that is useful, like a technological contribution that we can give to a wider conversation, and a kind of a spatial analysis that one can contribute to a conversation around public space, around performance space, around lived realities and all of that. But very often the architectural expert is seen as the central figure, when in fact we are not. So is it possible that I can share my screen for a minute?
I think that might be possible. Do you see the share screen option at the bottom of your screen?
Yes. So what I'd like to share is just this one image, and I'll zoom in. Can everybody see this image?
Yeah, Crystal.
So in essence, I came upon this image very late in my, and I you know, I see myself as still a student in this architectural, you know, or this idea of spatial practice. In fact, I've moved away from this idea that I am an architect. I have a particular spatial practice, and I think we all have a kind of a sense of space and a spatial practice embedded within our disciplinary chosen fields. You know, so performance has this particular spatial practice. Musicality has a particular spatial practice, literature has a spatial practice, photography has a spatial practice. We have a kind of a different spatial practice, which is a contribution to a wider sense of that thing. And I came across this image, which is taken by Paul Grendon, who has since passed on, when we were busy researching the design, or the beginnings of the design for a building for the University of the Western Cape. And what you see in this image is a complete debunking of my architectural training, because we were taught that architectural forecasting, using Ola's word, is around the design of a discrete space for a future purpose, an empty space, a space where inhabitants will come in later with their belongings and begin the process of dwelling. What we see in this image is the fact that this woman, Katrina Majid, who was photographed in 1991, constructing her house around her belongings already in the space. In fact, if you zoom in, there is a relative already inside. If you can see my mouse, can you see it? So her relative is already inside, and all her belongings is in the structure that she's busy constructing. And the way Paul has framed this image is that this structure is a discrete structure connected to a kind of a urban infrastructure, which is the water tower in the background. But what I also appreciate from this image is that Katrina is building this structure with complete resilience and power, and she is, you know, photographed in that particular moment of construction. I've since, you know, I see her as a very important spatial practitioner for myself, in how one should perceive a design for a building, you know, and how one can begin to abstract this particular idea that she's put out in the world, that one can construct around your particular resources that you've gathered in your lifetime already, including the people that you love, not the other way around, the way we've been trained, you know, in a kind of a sense of this abstract Newford, what did you say, Ola? This, in Sylvia Wynter's term, this kind of universal man who's going to come and, you know, and we all know the universal man is a particular man. So that is, I'm glad that I found this image, and I found this woman, and I found this particular structure, because it is a complete antithesis of our training.
Thank you so much. So powerful the way, like, once again, and what I'm really enjoying about this conversation is the tactility of it, the way in which both of you, and I think it's because of the nature of your practices, like a lot of what you do is about bringing immateriality into materiality, and so much of what you're saying is accompanied by so much material. Like, this is what it looks like for someone who has been excluded from the system of construction. This is what their version of world making looks like, and this narrative that is not a valid or a desirable model of world making is to be contested. And as Ola was saying, this making tangible this idea of the construction, the complicity in the construction of the domain, the performative domain of violence from the state onto the public, as something that architects are complicit in and do. That tactility is something that I really appreciate from both of you and both of your practices. And I want to circle back to a conversation actually that we were having before this live conversation, where Ilze, you said something very powerful. You said that crisis is an ongoing process. This idea that, or maybe talking back against this idea that there are moments of crisis, and how the framing of the coronavirus, the COVID-19 global pandemic, has been framed as this crisis that requires global attention. And you're proposing or pushing back against that this idea of crisis is a situation that we are continually enduring. And I want to use the words of the poet Naira Wahid in one of her poems in her debut poetry anthology, Salt, in which she says, "I don't pay attention to the world ending. It has ended for me many times and began again in the morning." And I remember reading an interview with Naira about what she intended by this, or what she meant by this, and what she was talking about, or what was very much at the forefront of her consciousness, was how for First Nation people, the world has ended. The apocalypse has occurred. The continued moments of colonization and the erasure of personhood, of nationhood from First Nation peoples all around the world, indigenous peoples, was an act of apocalypse. That was an act of crisis. And the crisis that we've seen over past months, Black Americans have been trying to put on the global stage with the Black Lives Matter protests, protesting or catalyzed by the murder of George Floyd, really articulating that the state of Blackness in America is and has been a state of ongoing crisis. And one of the things that, Ola, you talk about in your work, or that you present in your work, is the status of gendered bodies in the public domain or the public space, and how gendered bodies are also in a context or in a state of ongoing and continual crisis. And I was wondering, Ola, if you would be able to speak to that point specifically in relation to gendered bodies, and how those particular bodies experience jeopardy and experience crisis in the public space.
Absolutely. This also is one of the things that, hit hard, also very close to home, as they say. When I was in Khartoum, just recently, actually, they've announced that a particular policy called the public law order policy has been sort of taken out or stopped. And there was something really interesting. I'll just sort of tell the story as an example to sort of address that point of gendered space. So the public law order is this was a very vaguely written part of the criminal law, which basically stated it addresses the public, right? But in this space of Khartoum, in the urban scape, it's actually disproportionately applied on women. And so, but in essence, it's a law that monitors people's use of public space and requires them to uphold this, very open for interpretation, understanding of, public decency and whatnot. And I'm sure there's a sort of version of this everywhere in the world, but that's what it was called in Khartoum. And so when I first started to try to see why, the public space was in this law, like explicitly mentioned, and what frames, public decency, but also just what frames public in under this law. And it became very apparent to me also that people were like asking me questions of like, what is the definition of gender in the context of Sudan and Khartoum? And I was like, this is not really relevant to this conversation, because in this understanding of the public space, it became really clear that gender in itself is used in this text as a mode of preservation of state. So when you come out with your body, you know, female, for example, and you walk around and, you know, a policeman is, you know, interpreting this very vague text and, you know, says that you are, you know, indecent or whatnot. This is you, you have actually evoked that violence. And so it's such a, how do you say it? It's a foreclosure on your body, and so it becomes the site of socio-political shifts. And you're the host and the generator of something that keeps the state going, you know, with its understanding. And so it just became this space of impossibility for me. Public space became really a space of impossibility, and you are sort of the embodiment of it. And it made me think about how, you know, how you're inscribed in a state ideology, of course. And so a notion of state, your body became part of any understanding of notions of space. And this was also something that came in well, I wouldn't say in opposite, well, yeah, in contrast to the understanding of space as something that is kind of separate. It's something that you make separately, and this is how we do architecture. Something that you make separately from these type of political inscriptions of what, you know, gender is to be, but also how politics is sort of done, how you are part of it. It's an incredibly complex thing. But also, just to give us a tiny example, this public law order was also used a lot to raid little plots where tea ladies had set up in the urban scape. And a big number of women who work as tea ladies also come from, you know, the marginalized or displaced communities, or let's say just in the general term, people who have gone through the process of dispossession, you know, in the urban scape. And there was something about, of course, the way there was the informality of setting up, you know, shop to make tea, that created an alternative reading, and it had to keep a nature of temporality, because you needed to stay in one spot for just, for example, a month or so before the police intervenes. And so you have to go find somewhere else. And there was something about this this continuous change and transformation and moving about that allowed, you know, these bodies also to be able to generate income and be able to continue living. So under the system that purposefully tries to make life stop for these people, they're finding a way to continue. And so you're looking at tea ladies and realizing how they are, it becomes a reading of how the state is operating and what public space means and what their bodies evoke in terms of the public, in terms of state violence. And the examples, of course, are countless. And one main one that is, of course, also horrific was the massacre of June 3rd of June 2019, which basically was, and that was, in my opinion, incredibly telling about the language, how we are also taught the language of the state via architecture or via, we sort of soak up these sensibilities of the urban scape. So what happened in the massacre was basically demonstrators sort of barricaded themselves and created an enclosure where they can actually perform the sit-in inside of it. And to me, the fact that this very site, once it was cut out and carved out, and was supposed to be something premised on people's aspirations and desires and audible demands for a better future, became the very site where the state terror unraveled. and so to me, it always read like there's something about, you know, creating a spatial enclosure that seems to be directly linked with people's obliteration, basically. You know, whether it's obliteration from the political scene or from life. And we, probably all of you know that, you know, the notion of death and reenacting death and one's exclusion is very present in a Black feminist and just generally Black scholars writing, whether it be Frank B. Alderson with his idea of social death and whatnot, that you can never participate in this version of life unless you participate in your own exclusion. And that, of course, comes with all different ways and forms. Either it is by eliminating your physical presence, or by your ontology, you know, that you can't actually bring anything to the table. It just doesn't register with the notion of life. And I find these things just incredibly striking, that they do have a spatial undertone to a certain degree. And I'm like, if spaces seems to come up in all these really terrifying scenarios of state terror, then we're, you know, space would be a kind of central space. And of course, the geographic building of space should become central to any political conversation, you know. That, to me, like, you know, whether it's being in political parties or performing demonstrations, I feel that's something that's, of course, it's event-based, but what's going on is really, really on what's around you, you know, all the time. And so I feel that these moments, we have to kind of look closely at them to see how space is implicated. But the political project must continue as a spatial project of resistance against this type of violence. So yeah, that's my piece on that.
Thank you so much for that, Ola. I found it so powerful what you said about in order to participate in the public domain, in public space, in the act of taking up public spaces as a body that is gendered, there is an element of relinquishing of self, or there's an element of the erasure of self that needs to take place in order to be able to participate in that way. And I think, like you said, it has so many different kinds of resonances in so many different contexts, relating to not only feminism, but also Black feminism and Black theory, critical race theory, in how many contexts, whether it be in the workplace, whether it be in the school, whether it be in the on the playground, the ways in which, depending on your identity, and often these identities of Blackness, these identities of woman, of femme, of queer, etc., require in the public space an erasure of that identity in order to navigate it. And your localization of that in law, in the public law order, is so terrifying in its banality, in its quotidianness, and its everydayness, because it's a narrative that we see literally all over the world, countless times. And we see it with COVID in the regulation of beaches, the regulation of what used to be the supposed commons becoming increasingly more privatized property. And on that note, I want to, before I continue, I have to make a quick note and apology to both panelists, because I indicated to you that the ending time of this panel was supposed to be 8:30, but it's actually been communicated that it's 9 o'clock. That's a fault on my part. I'm so sorry. And in order to kind of respect the agreement that we've made, I'm wondering, is it possible for us, is it friendly for both of you, for us to go up until 9:15? And not necessarily up until 9, because I did communicate to you that it was 8:30. Is it okay if we go up until 9:15 with the conversation with both of you?
I think this is a very important conversation. I'd like to continue at least till 9:15. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm okay with that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ilze. Thank you so much, Ola. I just wanted to clarify that. I didn't want to just unconsensually take up your already stolen dinner time. So thank you for that. But on this note of the contestation of space, the ways in which marginalized identities require a certain relinquishment of identity in order to access public space, I want to revert back to Ilze. A lot of your work is looking at this specific reality in the context of apartheid South Africa, post-colonial South Africa. And as you said before in your introduction, your practice, your architectural practice, the offices are literally located in the Boerkap, which is an area that is rapidly gentrifying, where there are continuous kinds of contestations between the different communities that are living there, that are trying to celebrate their heritages, that are trying to work with the legacy of spatial apartheid. And you have this community of middle-class white people, international white people, Europeans, etc., that are moving into that space and creating an environment that is almost unlivable in terms of the way in which rent is increasing in the Boerkap. I wonder for you, in what ways, maybe not necessarily just in the Boerkap, but in Cape Town in general and in your practice, how that intersection of space, race, and the attending or the kind of composite histories that accompany that in terms of colonization and apartheid in that space, how they kind of collide for you in your practice.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a big question, and it's a driving principle for us, you know, in terms of how do we begin to critically analyze, as what Fred Moten talks about. And I'm so glad, Ola, you're talking about, you know, Frank Wilberson, Saadia Hartman, Frank Moten's readings about Afro-pessimism, because the thing about Fred Moten that he talks about is that one needs to begin to critically analyze anti-Blackness in order to think through how do we then begin to also weave in the celebratory aspects of Black life and Black spatial practice, in particular in my sphere. So that's a kind of, principle I'd like to go in. Let's look at critically the spaces of anti-Blackness and how they were constructed, and then think through at the same time, how is Black joy then also being practiced through architecture and space and gathering and collectivity, and think through it as a simultaneous moment. And I became very aware of this simultaneity when I was writing the book on the factory, which is a 10-minute walk from my house in Observatory, 20-minute walk from my office, maybe a bit more if you want to take a nice stroll down Lower Main Road in Woodstock. But Unstitching Rex True Form really revealed these simultaneities very precisely through modern architecture and through the laws that architecture actually preempted some of these laws of, separateness and, these laws that ascribed particular identities to us as human beings. So, for instance, the factory that was designed in 1938 by Max Polakansky was designed for, where the complete bank in the front of the factory was dedicated to cloakrooms, so changing rooms and toilets and areas where you come into the factory as a particular person that you feel that you are, whatever gender you would ascribe to, whatever class, whatever race, whatever, you're a full person, you're a complex person in the kind of society that you imagine yourself. But when you enter the factory, the building tells you that you are a non-European female, because those are the signs that get put up for where you need to go and change before you enter the workforce, right? Or you are a European female, or you're a non-European male, or you are a European male. So, or then another level of taxonomy takes place in terms of your class, so working class enter on the side of the factory, owners and entrepreneurs and managers enter from the front. So those class distinctions are inscribed in the architecture, and architectural practice preempted laws. These laws did not exist in 1998 that said we have to separate gender, class, race, and you know, all kinds of, you know, these different taxonomies. Those came 10 years later, you know, with the census 1951. We have, you know, 3 years after the nationalist government, the apartheid government in 1948 is in power. We have all these laws that that is essentially coming out of the census that were taken around the population, the 1951 Population Registration Act. So you had to register what, or actually you were told what you were, you know, by very young 18-year-old white people went out into the country and took census and told, you know, people what they were, where they lived, and wrote that up. And those became then the laws that dictated the group areas and, you know, these separate amenities laws, and all those laws then came out of that. But the factory already existed 10 years earlier with these various spaces in place. So in that project, it really became apparent the kind of power of architecture, but also the power of people to refuse that. So people also refuse those categories very, very vigilantly. So we have stories of transgendered factory workers who would arrive and not even go into the different separate staircases that were assigned to separate genders. They would just go into use the staircases that they felt like, you know, using, and they felt compelled to use, despite, you know, what the architecture said. And, you know, we have all kinds of those stories as well. So on the one hand, we have to pay homage to that refusals and to that, those kind of practices of being who you want to be in the world, as at the same time that you critically analyze the architectural, you know, inscription of, or the kind of power of the architecture. The two go together, you know. So there's, in the book, there's stories around pageantry and, you know, freedom of people, you know, expressing their genders at the same time as the architecture tried to limit that and try to enforce a different kind of order. Ola, you also mentioned the few words in your previous, you know, in this previous reaction or response around our architectural training was around order. How does one create order? And the architectural training and theory is all about structuring some order. And order, as we know, is extremely, you know, dictatorial in one hand, you know, and a part of our practice is also to think through disorder and disarray and undisciplined practices and undisciplined use of space. So in that sense, that is sort of my response to your question around how do we think through race and gender and class through the architecture.
Oh, yeah, so powerful. That piece about these young 18-year-old white people,
yeah,
making the space of South Africa, making society in the early to mid 1900s, and how much of that is not necessarily put on the agenda or put forward about who are these people making decisions about what then ends up becoming the Group Areas Act, which has so many resonances with the Berlin Conference, which created how we see and understand the nation states that we see in Africa today. And so much of what you're saying when you were talking about the pageantry, when you were talking about these expressions of multiple genders, and expressions of self that are not really accommodated by the architecture of that particular factory, makes me think of Jose Esteban Munoz, a queer cultural theorist from America, passed away I think in 2015. And he writes a lot about queer performance theory and really queerness as an umbrella for anti-normativity. So queerness encompassing Blackness, encompassing disability, as well as non-normative sexualities. And there's this beautiful thing that he writes in A Cruising Utopia, the Then and There of Queer Futurity, where he says, queerness is not yet here. Queerness is an ideality. Put another way, we are not yet queer, but we can feel it as the warm illumination of a horizon imbued with potentiality. We have never been queer, yet queerness exists for us as an ideality that can be distilled from the past and used to imagine a future. The future is queerness's domain. And that encapsulates so much of what it is that you're working through in that analysis of the Rex True Form Factory, where you're looking at how the reality created by the built environment is clashing with the imaginative force and the expressions of queerness from Black people, from femme people, from gender non-conforming people, from transgender people within that space, and how those two things can exist simultaneously, and how we can, as you have done, archive the past to see how people were living in these ways that were incongruous to their environment, and what we can take and extract from that to then think about how it is that we can build the future with that model. I want to give a reminder to our audience that if there are any questions, you're free to put them in the Q&A section, because we are coming to the kind of final few minutes of this engagement. So please, if you have questions, please slot them in the Q&A section, or if you are watching through Facebook, please put them in the comment section and they will be transplanted to the Q&A section. But I wanted to highlight something that you said, Ilze, and I'm going to paraphrase. I didn't catch it quite right, but I hope that I'm articulating its essence, where you were looking at this idea of Afro-pessimism and the way in which Fred Moten and frankly Wilderson are articulating it, and how there is a necessity for, or at the very least, the utility or the purpose of moving through Black subjugation is to approach Black joy, and how this is kind of a big essential kind of axis within your practice, which I find so motivating, and especially in this kind of context where a lot of what we are receiving in the media in relation to Black people, in relation to non-normative people is violence, and how you are proposing that the way in which we can approach joy, and the reason why it is important to not look away from the suffering and the subjugation and the violence is because that is the horizon through which we will approach Black joy. And I wanted to propose or send that back to both you, Ola and Ilze. In what ways do you see that particular axis of subjugation, oppression, violence as an access point to joy, and particularly Black joy and femme joy and queer joy manifesting in your practices and manifesting in your inquiries?
Well, I think for me that like any and maybe I should quote Sylvia Wynter here, is that she makes in her I don't know, I feel like there's something about her, she makes this statement where she says there's a sort of the perspective of struggle is actually imperative for any kind of momentum on some change. And you know, the people who, any person who's kind of functioning out of like this, or attempting to function outside of the binary, whether it's via their practice or there's a clear praxis, like what they understand, let's say, the philosophical assumptions behind their praxis, it becomes, I think, a kind of a mapping or a cartography that allows for us to or let's say carves out routes for us to kind of get to this outside. And I think I do agree with Sylvia Wynter 100% with this notion of like, it's imperative. It's imperative. You know, you have someone who's, these are populations that are, you know, subverting and are every day like severing their attachment and this sort of imposition by the state by existing, whether it's by, of course, you know, certain celebratory context, but just the belief, like these are alternative ways of being, and the fact that the world keeps operating under this notion that there's nothing, everything else is rendered obsolete, you know, and nothing else is possible is ludicrous, you know, and so that's why I always find these you know, this geography that's sort of drawn outside of this fixed route to life, you know, and this sort of linear notion of like, you know, you follow these steps to be part of this system, and we don't want to be part of the system. Nobody wants to be part of the system. We literally want to be able to exist without this system messing with us, you know. But so it's just, you know, it's something so kind of gets you under your skin, and you're just like, you know, F this, in a sense. But that's why I think if we are to center these geographies, I think there's the world around us will be fundamentally different, and we'll be able to premise, first off, reflect our aspirations onto the political dialogue, and, you know, onto whatever, you know, policies or world-making views, but also to premise things beyond, they take us beyond property, you know. So there's this, and this process of doing things, I think, will be able, enable us, let's say, to put on the, you know, to be able to sort of carry on the incommensurable, you know, as part of the process, and not just, for example, in this case of doing architecture, that we're not in this cycle of like, we generate materiality that holds and regulates, as Catherine McKittrick puts it, but it is something that allows for the incommensurable to be part of the you know, the process as well. So I think that ultimately will change things. I believe so. I'd like to believe so.
I mean, first off, if carrying the incommensurable is not the name of your PhD dissertation, I don't know what we're doing here. I don't know why we showed up. I don't know why we missed dinner with family, because trademark that is golden. Thank you. That's such a beautiful way to summarize the project. Carrying the incommensurable. I'm gonna carry and chew on that for some time.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would love to send the same question towards Ilze, looking at Black subjugation, Black oppression, and oppression in general as this horizon, as this imperative, in the words of Sylvia Winter, to liberation, this horizon of self-manifestation and the manifestation of community liberation. I wonder how for you see that potentially manifesting in your practice.
Yeah, I'm totally down for that. I mean, I think that's why I'm here, you know. I'm not, and I think the readings of like Fred Moten really, you know, nourishes our thinking and our practices and all of that. And I think, I mean, what I just would like to do quickly is just to read the exact passage that refers to this idea of the critical analysis of, so it's a bit of a mouthful. Can I do that? I'm going to try my best to do it in a kind of a way that's compelling. So just bear with me, because it's so important for this conversation, and I don't want the thread to become you know, I'd like to hold it with some of the text that he's written, you know, and he also quotes Saidiya Hartman in here. So there is a rich, rigorous, powerful, and utterly necessary analytic of anti-Blackness that enables that devotional practice. This is from Consent Not to be a Single Being. But to be committed to the anti-categorical prediction of Blackness, even as such engagement moves by way of what Mackey calls an eruptive critique of prediction's rickety spin rewound as endowment, even in order to seek the anticipatory changes that evade what Saidiya Hartman calls the incompatible predictions of the freed, is to subordinate by a measure so small that it constitutes measures eclipse the critical analysis of anti-Blackness to the celebratory analysis of Blackness. To celebrate is to solemnify in practice. This is done not to avoid or ameliorate the hard truths of anti-Blackness, but in the service of its violent eradication. There is an open set of sentences of the kind of Blackness is X, and we should chant them all, not only for and in the residual critique of mastery such chanting bears, but also in devoted instantiation, sustenance, and defense of the irregular. I just love Moten's writing. It's poetic, it's complex, and it says everything that we want to say, but I don't want it always just to collapse in this idea of Black joy, because it's a little bit more than that. No, it's more than the kind of, keywords that we then begin to circulate, around these ideas. It's a bit more than this kind of thinking. It's for me, there is this idea that, it's a complex, holistic one thing, to be critical about anti-Blackness in service of its eradication, right? And as a way of thinking through the practice of celebratory aspects of Blackness, So we can't just be critical of it and not do anything about it, It has to be in service of its eradication, right? And we have to think through, as a nourishment, how to think through ideas around the celebratory aspects of Blackness. So, yeah. How do we do that in architecture is my ongoing, concern.
I think that is so powerful, and I love that you've grounded us in not hashtagging
It's
the
woke. Let's not be woke here.
Let's not be hashtag woke. I think it was June. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I just want to shout out to Ola, because I've never actually been in conversation with where I have a sense that there's we've been reading this stuff I've been reading it with colleagues in the CHR and so on, but it's so wonderful to have a conversation with somebody with a similar concern in spatial practice and how this kind of nourishes our practice as architects. So I just want to say I really appreciate this.
Thank you.
This conversation with you.
Thank you. Likewise.
This is a genius link up. Thank you.
I have a few of my colleagues to also thank for that. So shout out to Monica, who is in the audience as well, for making the connect possible. There was a question in the chat for some of the authors' names. I've written a few: Fred Moten, Sylvia Winter, Jose Esteban Munoz. There were a few others that we mentioned. I think Hartman was one of them.
Yes.
And I think Frank B. Wilderson.
Yes. And the poet?
Sorry, the poet Naira Wai. Thank you for that reminder. So those names are just there. Adrienne Marie Brown, yes, that's an important one. Thank you, Marika. The names are there, and people can kind of just transport them to Google, and you'll find who's writing about what. They're all lit. And quite a few of them are still with us today and are very active in podcasting and YouTube panel discussions. Fred Moten and Sadia Hartman, very active. Adrienne Marie Brown is very active in the podcast. She's got a podcast of her own, How to Survive the End of the World, which is really, really fantastic. Naira Waid, sorry, Naira is with an H at the end of Naira. I misspelled that, but fantastic poet who has her debut collection of poetry available. I don't think it's available through Amazon anymore, which is probably a good thing. And Jose Esteban Munoz, you can find him really easily at most kind of bookstores. And his writing is quite widely shared on the interwebs. So we are, I think, at a good place to round up this conversation. I'm so thankful to both you, Ola and Ilze, for being so generous with where you are in your practices, where you are pushing your practices towards, how you are carrying the incommensurable to approach the celebration as a ceremonialization in practice. I love that. I hope both of you are writing PhDs utilizing all of these beautiful titles because they are delicious. But I'm really so appreciative of all of you for taking the time. I'm so appreciative to our audience who's joined us here in the Zoom webinar and who have joined us also on Facebook Live. I want to encourage everyone, if you've enjoyed this conversation, please do join us again. We will be having the next edition of Toestanden on the 30th of November, same time, same place. And before we round up, I wondered if there's anything, Ola, Ilze, that you want to leave us with, any projects that maybe you're working on, places that people can find you, or just a final word that you want to throw in there?
Well, currently I'm working on a publication on basically titled These Walls, Humanly Workable Geographies, and I'm working with the editors from Pars Journal just to see if there's a way also to kind of make it available. But other than that, also a thought of the outside should come to a wrap when I go back to Sudan soon. So hopefully I'll be able to do an online exhibit with some of the elements of that research. So be on the lookout on my, social media, even though I'm not that great with it, but I'm gonna try to launch with this on my Instagram. Let's see what happens though.
Shout out, plug. Follow Ola on Instagram for sure.
Yeah.
Facebook, if you're down with it. Fantastic Instagram feed. I'll be dipping in there, seeing beautiful things. So we appreciate you. We thank you. Ilze, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, thanks. I will definitely bother you, Ola, for some writing.
Of course.
Your own writings. Just send me links and things. But yeah, I've been working on a project on the house of Bessie Head, writer from Botswana, South Africa, and I just wrote a piece for the Architectural Review, which came out today. So it's about her garden and her house in Botswana. So that should, so there's something coming out. Yeah, I'll share that. So very excited
really happy
for that. But it's
conversation, just to put it out there.
Yeah, this is a great conversation. I'd love to continue this in the what you call it, in the DMs. I will slide into Ola's DMs.
Perfect.
Love that. I love that for you both. And
perfect. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for making the time and wishing a beautiful night.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Cool. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Cheers.
Bye.